Another method that modern anti-cult groups have incorporated from Nazism into contemporary practice is the creation of blacklists of organizations and groups which they have labeled as sects or cults, and which, in their opinion, should be eradicated. They regularly update these lists with new religious movements, making them targets for attacks. Naturally, this is presented as a necessary measure to ensure society's safety in the face of potential threats. Yet, let's go back to the Nazi times so as to draw one more parallel.
When the NSDAP seized power in Germany, and anti-cultists joined forces with them to fight against religious movements that supposedly posed a threat to the nation, the situation for religious minorities began to deteriorate significantly. In 1938, the Guidelines to Combating Sects was published, leading to extremely dire consequences for many dissenters. According to the guidelines, the danger of sects and cults manifested in the following: educating followers to have egocentric views and indifference towards all matters concerning the people and the state, refusal to take oaths and give the German salute, rejection of compulsory military service, rejection of taking on positions in state and movement organizations, refusal to participate in workplace assemblies and to work in the armaments industry, rejection of the National Socialist racial theory. Similarly, Dvorkin, on the portal he created, the Information and Consultation Center of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, posted a list of organizations he labeled as destructive cults and totalitarian sects. Each criticized organization has a page featuring a list of negative publications about it from various media sources, which were apparently initiated by the center itself. The style of these publications about different organizations is very similar. They are filled with identical emotional and judgmental headlines and descriptions, and extensively use emotionally charged language, in essence, hate speech. This includes deliberate defamation and the portrayal of members of the criticized groups with dehumanizing labels such as zombies, rapists, slaves, beasts, and other dehumanizing epithets. By means of similar rhetoric, in their time, Nazis dehumanized Jews. Now you see the lists compiled by the Nazis on one side, and, for comparison, the list compiled by the leader of the Russian terrorist anti-cult group, Alexander Dvorkin, on the other. As you can clearly see, the anti-cultist list encompasses virtually all religious minorities in the Russian Federation, including even some representatives of Orthodoxy, whose views differ from the main line of the country's official religion. Additionally, the list includes some business enterprises and secular organizations. Similar lists can be found on the websites of other anti-cult organizations. And among those lists, you can also find a large number of secular organizations in addition to religious ones. These include various medical, sports, social, research, and scientific organizations. In total, millions of people have already been labeled by the anti-cultists. This demonstrates the unimaginable scale of the campaign of harassment against innocent people that the anti-cult movement has launched worldwide.
The primary objective of the lists of the so-called sects is to precisely identify to society, law enforcement, and authorities the so-called dangerous antisocial elements that must be fought against, even to the point of complete eradication. We can see the consequences of creating such lists in the rise of Nazism in Germany.
It is known that a directive signed by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of internal security in Nazi Germany, established the procedure for suppressing certain religious societies and sects, as well as arresting and sending all associated individuals to concentration camps. Among other things, it contains the following lines: immediate measures will be taken against organizations, clubs, unions, and circles, as well as against leaders and individual people. All organizations, clubs, unions, circles, etc., all without exception will be purged. Existing materials specifically address lists, card indexes, correspondence, equipment, occult items, writing supplies, and any property will be confiscated. They will be dissolved and banned. Simultaneous searches will be conducted in the homes of leading members of circles, as well as those suspected of possessing such materials. Persons dedicated to secret teachings and sciences are subject to arrest in all cases. Their activities will be banned without exception, under threat of the harshest measures from the state police. In each individual case, they must be sent to a concentration camp. This operation must be carried out throughout the entire Reich, if possible, between 7 and 9 a.m.
Just as anti-cultists did in Nazi Germany, Dworkin and his network of anti-cult groups provide authorities with materials about representatives of the so-called cults and sects. Dworkin's center issues defamatory expert opinions on the nature of various groups, prompting authorities to investigate and prosecute them. This slander against innocent people in Russia, just as in the Third Reich, already results in brutal persecution and physical reprisals against citizens. The ideas promoted by Dworkin reflect the same Nazi stance expressed by Hack, Kunert, and Hitler: hatred of dissent, intolerance, rejection of pacifism, and justification of violence. And this is just one example of many anti-cultists, but it is enough to see their direct connection to Nazism. These are direct proofs that Nazism never disappeared. It has merely changed its form and adapted to new external circumstances. Yet, we can observe a direct line of transmission of knowledge, experience, and methods for combating dissenting groups of people with the aim of their complete eradication. Representatives of global anti-cultism use all Nazi methodologies, but for their purposes, they have expanded and refined them. Thus, the flame of Nazism has intensified. Now you see evidence proving that global anti-cultism is a formidable force that has already gained significant power and is striving towards its goal: the complete destruction of democratic values and the establishment of a new Fourth Reich.
Chapter 4: Anti-Cultism Crimes Against Humanity.
The path where citizens' freedoms are trampled upon amidst their own approving cheers leads only to one end. It seems that you have started to forget about this, and those who do not remember their past are doomed to relive it. Therefore, I will remind you of the final destination of this path. Humanity now treads, and the depth of the abyss into which anti-cultists and the hidden shadow force behind them are pushing it. One person once said, with frightening prescience, that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. And shortly thereafter, all of humanity witnessed firsthand the embodiment of this prediction. Or rather, just logical reasoning in the horrors brought by Nazism. The citizens of Germany barely had time to react before the Nazi Party transformed from a fringe group into the country's leading political force, bringing with it terror, war, and genocide. Today, Nazism is remembered as the embodiment of extreme hatred, intolerance, discrimination, and totalitarianism, everything that is inhumane and anti-human. So now you know that Nazism in its most atrocious form was instigated by the anti-cultists of that time. All those methods used by the Nazis were typical of the anti-cultists from the most ancient times, and they rely on them even now. During the rise of Nazism, the anti-cultists instilled in Hitler and his henchmen the belief that only through fear could they conquer the world and win people's love, that it was the fastest and most effective way to gain total power, and so it happened. One of the main methods the Nazis resorted to at that time was genocide of individual dissenting groups and of entire nations. And if you closely examine the history of humanity, it becomes clear that genocide has always been a tool to strengthen the power of those who stand at the root of the modern form of anti-cultism. Now, let's recall where it all started during the Nazi era and draw a parallel to how the anti-cultists operate now. Nazis, at the instigation of their anti-cultist advisors, acted in a planned and systematic manner, preparing public opinion through propaganda, or rather through the manipulation of mass consciousness, convincing the German population to the necessity of war and genocide. Now, I will provide clear examples of what the present-day anti-cult movement already represents at its core, and what it could degenerate into if it remains unexposed.
Genocide.
The sequence of actions and the destructive focus of anti-cult organizations clearly indicate that they ultimately lead to the same outcomes as those brought about by Nazism. Right now, in front of the global community, the international terrorist network of anti-cultists is preparing the world for a new genocide. As a result of their actions, millions of people have already been labeled as members of cults, putting them in the position of potential victims. Those of you who have studied what genocide is understand that it is a process that unfolds over time. It does not happen in a day. Society is systematically and gradually prepared for genocide. This process has rather specific stages that can be described and, most importantly, recognized when they are being put into action.
Genocide refers to any actions committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Common risk factors include societal instability, increasing intolerance, systematic human rights violations, lack of state protection for the population, and the presence of motives and incentives in the information field that justify the use of force against specific population groups. The first stage of planned genocide is the dehumanization mentioned above.
The process and all its stages can be vividly observed in the example of the Holocaust. After the Nazis came to power, they began the first stage, propaganda that Jews were not human and that they posed a threat to society. Caricatures and articles demonizing Jews started to emerge. The myth of a global Jewish conspiracy was actively promoted. Gradually, people, the German population, became convinced that Jews were indeed a threat to them and their children,